right, well, welcome to our next tutorial. This tutorial is going to be on Y seams. What is a Y seam? Y seam is anytime there are three seams that meet together to form a Y, like these three seams, or the seams on the corners of this. So Y seams are often used on quilt borders of quilts or borders of blocks where you want to miter that corner. You're not putting corner stones. You're actually wanting a diagonal mitered seam. That's a Y seam. As you see with this one, this is with hexagons and diamonds. This is also a Y seam because you have three seams coming together at one point. There's some special things you need to know about Y seams, which is why we're doing this. Some people don't understand them, and that's okay. Hopefully by the time we get done with this, we will understand this. Let's get started first off with the standard things about all of my tutorials. Remember, as a general rule, my measurements are exact, and that I don't normally write patterns for you to trim, make oversized to trim later. There are some parts of this you'll trim after, but that's kind of normal. There are a few exceptions to this oversized rule. This is not really one of those. Also, remember, I do have a distinct dislike for showing unsupported bias seams. I usually have you do things like make two of things, or foundation paper piecing, or flip and fold corners to avoid that diagonal seam. Now, on your hexagon, you're going to have a diagonal seam. That's just the nature of one of these. At least one side of the hexagon that you're going to sew this on is going to be a diagonal, an unsupported diagonal edge. What I did on this one is I put Best Press on it. I sprayed it good with Best Press to keep it from stretching. So that's another thing you can do for unsupported bias seams. Also, remember, standard practice of all quilt pattern writers, not just me, is that we give our dimensions in finished sizes. If we tell you something is like a 3-inch half square triangle, that's 3 inches after it's sewn into the quilt. It's 3.5 inches when it's not sewn in, so that you have that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. But if someone says it's a 3-inch half square triangle, remember, okay, it's 3.5, not sewn in. It's 3 inches. You see 3 inches of it once it's sewn in. Same thing with if someone says, hey, let's make a 12-inch block. That doesn't mean trim your block down to 12 inches. That means it's going to be 12 inches after it's sewn in, so your block needs to be 12.5 total inches. It just makes some of the math actually easier that way. So very rarely do I tell you to do math based on unfinished measurements, and actually there's places where other designers tell you to based on unfinished measurements, and I've always converted those to finished measurements. So if it ever happens that you're going to use math based on the unfinished sizes, I will tell you so. All right, so let's get started making these Y seams. Let's start off with the math. So there's not exact, it's not like I'm not having you make a 12-inch block. I'm telling you how so you can do quilt borders or hexagons. But there is some math to this. So what you need to know, you need a base piece, and you need strips of fabric that you're going to sew onto the base piece. In this case, your base piece is this square. It is a 6-inch finished, 6.5-inch unfinished square. It's got a 90-degree corner. Then you're going to need to make your Y seam. After you need base piece, you need 2 strips to make your corner. This one actually has 4 corners, obviously. So the math to figure out how long to make your strips is the length of your base piece, the unfinished length of your base piece, plus the width of your strips times the number of corners each strip is involved in. So in this case, this was a 6.5-inch unfinished square, so I need 6.5 inches to start with. My strips are 3 inches finished, 3.5 inches unfinished. So I have 6.5. We'll start with that. And then I'm making 2 corners. So I need the 3.5 times 2 is 7. So 6.5 plus 7 is 13.5. That's how long my initial strips were to make this. For The hexagon here, I'm just kind of made it kind of artistic, some shading dimension. It would look kind of cool put in like this. So for the hexagon, my sides are 3.5 inches unfinished, but each strip is only involved in one Y seam. So my strip length is 3.5 inches. Again, the strips are still 3.5 inches wide. So it's 3.5 inches for the edge of the hexagon, plus the width of the strip, only times one though, because it's only involved in one Y seam. So 3.5 plus 3.5 times one, which is a total of 7 inches. So that is the math on this. All right, so now let us turn over to the cutting mat and I will get started showing you how this gets put together.
Here are all the pieces that we're going to use. I'm going to make both of these models simultaneously, so I have all the pieces here. I have my 6.5-inch square, which will be 6 inches finished. I have my 4 13.5 by 3.5-inch strips to sew around that 6-inch square. And I have my hexagon with 3.5 inches on each side and 2 strips that are 3.5 by 7 to sew onto the hexagon. Start by preparing the base piece. Turn your base piece wrong side up and decide which corner you're going to be making the Y seam in. Make a small mark 1/4 inch from each edge at this corner, forming an X. Now, if you're going to be making Y seams at more than one corner of the base unit, go ahead and make the marks all the way around wherever you need them. Now we need to prepare the strips to be sewn on. So you need to mark the back of each strip, the distance from the end of the strip that is equal to the width of the strip. So all the strips that I'm using are 3.5 inches wide. So I need to measure 3.5 inches from the end of the strip down the length of the strip and make a mark on the back there. Now let's put things together so to be ready to sew them. You're going to align the mark on the back of the strip with the corner of your base unit. Again, note you're not aligning your X on the base unit with the mark on the strip. You're aligning the corner of the base unit with the mark on the strip. Right sides together, pin everything together. You're going to be sewing from the base unit side, so you'll probably want to put your pins that side because you're going to have that side up. Now we sew this seam, and we don't just start from the edge. You're going to start at the X, not from the edge of the base unit. Make sure the base unit's on top. Start at the X, sew 4 or 5 stitches forward, stop, sew 4 or 5 stitches or however many it takes to get back to the X. Sometimes the back stitches are a little bit bigger than the forward stitches. Be aware of that. And then sew forwards, continuing the seam. This is going to lock this seam. We need to do this because there's not going to be any other seam crossing this one to lock it. So this is how you lock the seam. Now when you get to the other end, if the seam, this strip is going to have a Y seam at the other end, you need to similarly lock the seam. So just to the X, back stitch 4 or 5 stitches, and then sew forward again to the X. Fold the end of the first strip back on itself and pin it back out of the way. You don't want to get it caught in the stitching when you sew the second strip to the base unit. Now place the second strip along the edge where it needs to go, again aligning the mark on the back of the strip with the corner of a base unit, similar to how you did with the first strip. Now let's sew the second strip on. Again, sew with the base unit up so you can see your X's that you've made on the base unit, and backstitch just at the X. Do not sew to the edge of the fabric. Make sure you do not catch the first strip in this seam. Now we're ready to set up to sew the two strips together. We do not want to catch the base unit in this third seam. We've already sewn two seams with the base unit to each strip. Now we've got to pull the base unit out of the way and sew the two strips together. So fold your base unit in half through the corner where we're making that Y seam. If it's a square, you're going to fold it, it's going to look like a triangle. If it's a hexagon, you're going to fold it, it's going to look like a trapezoid. Make sure that your right sides are together and that the edges of your strip are lined up, and so they're ready to, they're all aligned. Pin that base unit back and out of the way so it's not going to get caught. And now we're going to draw our seam line. If your base unit is a square or rectangle, something with a 90-degree angle, you're going to draw a line starting from where the first two seams end at a 45-degree angle out and away towards the outer edge of the loose strips. You're going to sew on that line when the time comes. If it is a hexagon, you're going to draw your line again starting from where the first two seams end, and kind of may depend on what your ruler says. On my ruler, I actually have the 30-degree angle lined up with the outer edges of the strip. Your ruler, possibly, if you have a different ruler, might have the 60-degree angle lined up there. That's a question mark. But anyway, you'll draw a line out again from where the first two seams end out toward the loose ends of the strips. And again, no matter what angle we're going for here, the drawn line should extend as a straight line from the fold of the base unit out to the loose ends of the strip. Now sew the two strips together, again being careful to not catch the base unit in the seam. Start at the point where the first seams end, lock this with a section of backstitching the same way you did with the first two seams, and sew on the line out to the edge of the strips. Carefully trim off the excess fabric from the seam allowance of the strips, cutting 1/4 inch away from the seam, and being careful to not cut the base unit. Unfold the unit. You should now have 3 seams meeting together at one point, forming a Y. Press the first 2 seams toward the strips and press the third seam to one side. To form the diamonds from the strips attached to a hexagon, now go back and trim the other end of the strip so that they line up with the edges of the hexagon.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed learning how to make Y seams. There's one more thing I wanted to add on. I had you making Y seams with strips with square edges. I didn't have diagonals. There are some quilt designers that will tell you, like on the hexagons, they're going to actually tell you to cut the diamonds first and then sew them on. They're not going to give you just the square edge and then you trim it afterwards. Another place where you might end up having to have, you'll be sewing that final seam of your Y seam on the diagonal with it trimmed is, for instance, this block. This is called Ocean Waves, and the frame around here is foundation paper pieced. And so these final diagonal seams here, those are already on the diagonal. They're not unsupported, however, because you left your foundation paper piecing paper on the back of them until you get those seams sewn. So that's just a heads up that some designers will have you use the diagonal first. All right. Anyway, so we have done our Y seams. We have made a 6-inch block with a frame around it. Same technique for the whole larger quilt if you're wanting to put a whole large border around a quilt. This sort of block is often handy if you have, sometimes a collection will have like a printed block, a small printed block, and you want to put a frame around it and make a pillow, or put a frame around it and put it in a bigger block in your quilt or whatever. So that's handy for that. And like I said, this is real handy for kind of, if you can imagine this put into like quilt, and it kind of looks, it gives it some artistic dimension maybe to your hexagons. Honestly, you could also do a full hexagon quilt and have hexagon on hexagon on hexagon. A lot of people do that English paper piecing by hand. You actually could do it by machine. Lots of little seams. So that's a thought there too. All right, well, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. YouTube really likes the algorithm if you give it a thumbs up. Share it with any friends who need to learn how to do Y seams, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.